Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. This month is Career Development Month, so it seems fitting that I should be talking to Rozalyn, career strategist and best-selling author of Get Your Career Unstuck. Join us as we delve into the narratives we create for ourselves as to why we get stuck in certain roles and what defence mechanisms we might be bringing out to play. So welcome back to the show, everyone. And today I'm really excited to bring another guest to the show. I'm delighted to welcome Rozalyn, who is a career strategist and, very excitingly, an Amazon best-selling author with her book, Get Your Career Unstuck, which I have read, absolutely love for a million different reasons. So I'm delighted that Roz is going to come and talk to us today. I've got a gazillion different questions for you, Roz. But for those people who aren't as lucky as I am to know you, do introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks, Julian. Thanks for having me. Yeah, so my background's ultimately recruitment, although I have had a couple of different career changes. And then I'm also a career coach and mentor. So I help people with career change or job search. And then, as you mentioned, I also recently published Get Your Career Unstuck, which I'm super proud of and very impressed that you've read. And yeah, excited to kind of hear your feedback on that and your thoughts.
I have a very well-thumbed copy. I found it absolutely fascinating. And there were several reasons that I loved it. I really loved it for the stories. The stories absolutely make it, because it's real life, isn't it? This is what people go through. We don't have the careers. I don't know why I'm thinking of Terry and June at the moment. Those of you who are aware, Terry and June, he had a career and you could see that he was going to stay in that job for 30, 40 years. We don't have that kind of career anymore. That idea that we will start a job at 21 and we'll get a gold carriage clock at age 65. So people are going to get stuck. And it was fantastic to hear all about different people's stories.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was very selective of the people that I picked to include in the book, and I'm really privileged that they entrusted me with their stories to share. And I really wanted people that what I would term normal people, because I think there's a lot, certainly over the last decade with reality TV, I think, and certainly social media, a lot of people's putting out there, oh, I quit my job and I'm an overnight success. And it's just not real. And so I really wanted to get across that there's these individuals who have perhaps had corporate, maybe started out thinking they needed a linear career, because that's ultimately what, we've been programmed, I think, in many respects in education to follow. And then, each one has a different story where they've made a career change for lots of different reasons. Either they didn't feel fulfilled because of their values. It might have been a life event such as divorce or ill health, for example. And that has kickstarted their journey. And not all of them through that career change has stayed in the career that they changed into. And so they're kind of honestly sharing their journey, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But I think the theme is that they don't regret leaving the job that they felt unfulfilled in. And so it's a very honest account, and these people genuinely exist. You can go and look them up on LinkedIn and social media. I've met many of them. I've spoken to them, obviously. I've had drinks and lunch with many, and they're fascinating people. But I think the point was really to showcase in the book that anybody ultimately, feeling unfulfilled, that there is other options and you can do it and you can make a career change ultimately at any age. And I think also to add on that is definition of success, because I think we are, and again, I put this maybe down to kind of like the media. I think we kind of define success as flashy cars and, big houses and lots of holidays and designer wardrobes. And I think what was interesting interviewing these individuals who shared their stories in the form of letters in the book is that their definition of success is the complete opposite of that. It's having more time with family and friends. It's doing the things that you're passionate about. It's well-being and wellness and health. And that sort of freedom in many respects to be in charge of your own destiny. So for me, it was, it was an absolute honor to have them feature in my book, and many of them become really good friends now. So which is really, really, really lovely. And it's quite funny because if I'm out and about with them and we're, at a networking group or wherever, and they'll suddenly go, oh, I'm in Roz's book, or I'll be like, oh, this person's in my book. And it's just a lovely connection that I will always have with these individuals, which is quite incredible, really.
I loved that they are real people, because you're right. They have either got their website or a way that you can link in with them at the end of their letters, at the end of their stories in your book. And I thought that was incredibly powerful, because in so many of these things you have almost like case studies, and Barry did this or Sue did this, and you think, and then it says at the bottom, not their real name. And you think, well, could be anybody, couldn't it? It could be anything that the authors made up. So I love that they're real.
Thank you.
One of the questions that I had when reading the book is, this is such a universal thing. I think all of us have been, at one point or another, been in a job where you think, is this it? I don't know that I can do this for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So what do you think it is that, even if we've recognized I'm not happy, why do you think some people are stuck?
It's like the $1 million question, isn't it? I think it's a variety of reasons, and I think it also depends where they are in their lifetime. So a lot of coaching clients that come to me tend to be that midlifers. So what we term as Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980. And I think for them in particular, they have this dual financial burden where they're responsible for their kids going off to university. And let's be frank, a lot of kids are coming back from university and moving back home and not leaving the nest until much older now. There's people not leaving until they're kind of 30, and they need sort of mom and dad to help them to get onto the property ladder. And then on the other end, they're also responsible for their elderly parents. So, they can be caregivers as well. So I think that generation in particular, it's not unsurprising they're called the squeezed generation. So I can imagine for them that, if they're wanting to make a career change, there's probably a lot of factors, including finances, because no doubt they may well still have a mortgage as well. So that financial burden, I think also, a lot of them, when I speak to them, there's this sense of feeling irresponsible or ungrateful for what they have and wanting to make that change. So there's a pressure that they're placing on themselves. So I definitely think that plays a part. I think also, if we look at sort of what's happened over the last few years with lockdown in particular, I think that has shone a light on people's values, and they've lifted their head above the parapet and gone, oh my gosh, I'm halfway through my life. Is this it? But of course, the cost of living also adds to that pressure. I mean, there's been a real wage stagnation over the last decade. And I think also in times of recession, if you've been working for a company for a certain period of time, you've either got certain perks and benefits or that long-term service that if you were to leave and start over at another company, and in times of economic downtime, there's no sense of maybe security, you're kind of thinking, well, if I get made redundant, I don't have that years of service, or I'm giving up those kind of benefits to kind of switch career. So I think there's that pressure as well. So certainly the financials come into it. I think also there's an element of, and again, I think with that generation, we were brought up to think about a linear career, that whole you leave, A levels or college and you go off to university, and it's almost an expectation. And certainly, I was first generation going to university, and it was just my parents just expected that. There was no discussion, there was no debate. It wasn't there were no other options. And so I think education, I think parents, particularly those baby boomers, were very much of the mindset that, you, in order to be successful, you get an education, you go to university, you then get onto a grad program or into some sort of corporate career, and you work up the ladder. It's that sort of rope career. You're kind of climbing upwards, and then of course, you get married, you have a house, you have children, you have a picket fence, and then you retire, right? And you get your carriage clock, and you live happily ever after. But I think what's important to remember is that, the baby boomers, they didn't necessarily have mortgages by the time they were sort of retiring. They'd paid those off, but equally, they were retiring earlier. Potentially, they could retire at like 55. That is no longer an option now. I mean, we're retiring at sort of 66, 67, but I'm seeing retirees coming out of retirement now because of cost of living. I live in West Sussex. I've spoken to many taxi drivers and people, and they've come back out since lockdown. I think what was interesting in lockdown is that there was something like, I think it was a stat by the Office of National Statistics, like something, there was this great resignation, as it was termed, where I think there was something like 1.6 million people resigned from their jobs, and now it's being retermed as the great sabbatical because people are coming back. And certainly ex-colleagues of mine who retired, who I've kept in touch with, were looking forward to retirement. They're now picking up consulting and contracting work because, again, the cost of living has gone up so much. So I think there's all this kind of pressure around certainly the financials, and certainly I think we've been programmed to not take a risk and to follow this kind of linear career, because otherwise it's considered unsuccessful or a failure. And I think that's quite interesting. Whereas I think the younger generation are prepared to kind of take that risk and prepared to kind of switch careers and pivot if they're not necessarily happy. And I do see that because part of my role as a recruitment director is that I also, although I recruit at all levels, I do look after our intern and grad program. And so I speak to candidates of that age group. And again, since lockdown, many of them are sort of now questioning, actually, is this degree, should I have studied that that degree subject? Do I really want to go into a grad program? And I'm seeing a lot of them declining offers in favor for going and taking gap years, traveling and doing something completely different before returning, more so than ever. And I guess that's not surprising, because if I think about, for example, the internship program that we were running, we moved ours virtual, but a lot of other companies cancelled their intern programs. And so you had all these students, during the summer holidays, sitting at home in lockdown, nowhere to go, nothing to do, no virtual program, nothing to add to their CV, feeling probably quite deflated and depressed, and worried about where they would be in the pecking order of getting a job at some point. And then you ended up, once they all graduated, a lot of them didn't get graduation days because of lockdown. And then, came onto the market, and there was an influx of people who just, normally they would come away from their internship with a grad offer, and that wasn't the case and everything. So I think that's impacted that age group. And I think mental health also has a lot to do with it, about what's happening in sort of workplaces. I think when there's particularly an economic downturn, companies do kind of squeeze financial resources. Training and development is the first thing that tends to go out the window. For example, obviously we've got AI coming in, as you know, and a lot of companies are very excited around sort of chat GBT and what that can do, but they're not necessarily upskilling their workforce. And that's an interesting one. And that's something I'm very interested to kind of watch and see how that works, because I think there's also this fear factor of people thinking, well, I don't want to change careers, in case I'm going to get made redundant, or is artificial intelligence going to come and take my job, so am I just better staying put for the time being? And I think I think it's by 2030 or something, it's going to be something like a quarter of the workforce will be over the age of 55. So I'm curious again to see, well, what are companies going to do to upskill that age group, to feel comfortable with AI. But equally, if AI is coming in and reducing the workforce, what are those individuals going to do? So it's a very long answer to your question. But I think there's a lot of factors, and I think this is what's playing on people's minds, particularly again, clients when they come and see me, is this is where they're at. They feel unfulfilled, they want to make a change, they don't want to be in the same job or necessarily the same industry doing the same thing for the next 30 to 40 years. They want to be doing something different and exciting and be passionate. And yes, they read the stories similar to kind of people in my book, and they see it can be done. But I think unfortunately we get into our head, that sort of lizard brain of that fear factor of that sort of freeze, where it's like, well, we'll do nothing because actually I've my job's maybe well paid and I've got great benefits, and I have all these people relying on me, my kids, my elderly parents, so actually I'll just keep going. And then one day turns into next, another year, and unless something happens like redundancy or a life event, it's almost like we're happy to be kind of comfortably uncomfortable. So that's always an interesting one, and I see a lot of that when people come for career coaching. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of rationalisation there, isn't there?
There is.
It's absolutely fine. I can decide that I need to be in this role because of X, Y, Z. And you can see that people rationalise. And like you say, if you've got a generation above and a generation below that are relying on you, it's scary to make a leap.
It is. Yeah. There's that feeling, I think, of being selfish sometimes, having to put themselves, wanting to put themselves first, but they have so many people, to say, depending on them. And sometimes that's it's true, of course, but actually it's unpacking some of that thinking. What is that narrative we're telling ourselves over and over again? Is when we start to kind of boil it down and doing maybe like a financial audit, is that the reality? And again, do you need the big house? Because that's the other thing, I think, is that sometimes there's that element, particularly in the UK or first world countries, of keeping up with the Joneses. And often enough, when you sort of go through coaching and sort of unpacking these kind of fears and these worries, some of it is that voice on our shoulder, as I call it in the book, my froggy, my little sort of lizard that kind of sits there saying, well, you can't do this, and what will so and so think? And actually when we just take that noise away, because I think often enough, and you'll know this with coaching, is that clients often need that time and space to reflect. And that's what's so beautiful about coaching, is it gives them that. And it's asking them very powerful questions that either they've not thought of or been asked for before, or they're now in a space where they've got that time to really think it through, what that means to them. And so often enough, they go away with sort of, time to reflect, come back. And sometimes it's not as bad as I thought it was, or actually there are these other options I hadn't considered. So I think it's not all doom and gloom. I know what I've kind of outlined there about why people come to me for coaching and sort of the world. But actually, I think there's something beautiful in all of that, because I think whenever whenever there's what feels like maybe an obstacle, actually, I think that's opportunity. I think it's opportunity to take stock of one's life and to be in a position to say, well, actually, what do I want? And everything that up until this point is not a waste, it's not a failure, it's all these wonderful things in your toolkit to take further.
I'm just wondering as well, what is the driver, if there is a general one, or maybe it's very individual for each person, what is the driver that makes somebody go, you know what, I'm going to book in a session with Roz?
Yeah. Yeah. And do you know what? It's fascinating because sometimes some people reach out and then you don't hear from them for a while and then they come back. Because I think often enough people people want a quick fix, right? And again, with finances, they have to weigh up, coaching. And I think they then realize it's an investment for them. But if they're having to make a decision, in that moment of, do I go on holiday or do I pay for coaching or do I pay for, this needs fixing on the house, then, so there's an element of people going away and then sort of popping up again. And I think there's also that no like trust where I have lurkers, let's say, on LinkedIn or wherever, and that's totally fine. Or somebody might contact me and say, "Oh, I've read your book," or "I was talking to so and so, and they said I should contact you." Or the other one is, I'll get somebody who'll say, "Can you speak to my husband? He needs help with this," right? And that's fine. It doesn't matter which route they've come through. I think often enough it is an event that has triggered it. They've been unhappy for a long while. They felt unfulfilled for a long while. It's not a case of it's a little bit of dissatisfaction and they're unhappy on one particular day. It's people who ultimately have been unhappy for quite some time. But what we're very good as human beings is distracting ourselves. So we're very good at going, I'm really unhappy in my job. Okay, I'll rationalize it that it pays well, or I like my colleagues, or I like the variety of the work, or I'm not sure I'll find another job like this, or I'm too old, or, to make that change. And you come up with all this kind of, reasons to stay comfortably uncomfortable because of, you worry of the unknown. And so we fill it with things. We fill it with retail therapy, maybe alcohol or holidays or, whatever we fill it with other distractions. And then what happens is, and this is where I think the universe is quite beautiful, right? You're unfulfilled, the universe will knock and it will keep knocking. And we don't listen because we're too busy with day-to-day chores and everything else. And then suddenly it does literally lift the rug from beneath you. So often enough, it's people will come to me because they've been made redundant. It's a shock. They weren't expecting it. It's now throwing up to them, well, actually, is this the time to make a change? Or they've been on the market and they're struggling to find a job and they're going for the same job, even though it's not what they want to do. It doesn't fit with their values. But it makes sense to them because that's all they've known. And so it might be that they come to me initially to say, look, can you just help me with my job search? I need help with my CV. I'm re-entering the market. I haven't interviewed for, quite a period of time. And then actually, when we start to look at things and talk through, actually, this is more of a coaching than a mentoring situation. And so it's normally some sort of event that will have sparked it. Having said that, I mean, that's still an event. I had a friend over this weekend, no names mentioned, who turned 50, came back from holiday, celebrated birthday, and quit a job. And that was it. She's got nothing to go to. It was a big decision because she's now, it's obviously something her and her husband obviously discussed on holiday, but she's been feeling unfulfilled for some time. And she said, look, it's going to be tight. She said, but I just couldn't spend, any more time there. I just couldn't. And that was it. And the event there for her was turning 50. And that was it. She made the decision there and then. So I think something happens. Could be illness, could be a relationship breakdown. It can also be work related stress, a toxic environment. And I think with that one, people tend to have lost confidence in their ability. It's almost like it's called like workplace Stockholm syndrome, where literally you have this irrational attachment to that job, to that company, even though you're grossly unhappy. And it might be because maybe you do like your colleagues, for example. So despite the fact that you know it's toxic, you know that it's not healthy being there, that it's impacting you, you stay there. And that's quite an interesting one, because that takes time to help that individual kind of detach from that, which is interesting, because I don't think that gets talked about enough. But I think that will come out more and more as as we talk more about kind of mental health now. That's very much, which is great. That's being spoken about a lot more, and there's a lot more kind of support out there. But yeah, I think that's one that's always quite interesting. So those are kind of some of the reasons that people reach out, but it tends to be an event. Very rare have I had somebody go, I've just been thinking, there's something a bit better out there. I feel like life's a bit vanilla. No, it very much tends to be something has spurred them on to, they've got to a point of desperation now, and they're like, right, this is now too uncomfortable. I have to kind of seek support to help me work this one through. Yeah.
Well, as humans, we only change when the power of staying the same is worse than the pain of changing. Did I say the
Yeah.
power? The pain of, let me get this right. The pain of not changing. We only change when the pain of not changing is worse than the pain of staying. I think
100%.
I've got.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's why we don't we're creatures of habit. We don't like change.
No, we don't. 100% we don't like change. No, we're very, very, very comfortable. And again, we see change as it's a risk, and that's understandable, and that comes from, our kind of survival mode and everything. But I think what's interesting now is, getting people to kind of reframe that as opportunity. And again, with failure, it's opportunity. There's no such thing ultimately as failing. It's as Carol Dweck says, doesn't she? It's you just haven't learned it yet. So I think, yes, I think it's that growth mindset, helping people to adopt this mindset of, yes, there's this unknown, but actually that could be really exciting. I mean, what if on the other side there, that's ticking every box you were looking for, that job's amazing. I think we talk ourselves out of things a lot and miss opportunities. And in fact, going back to the book again, that's something I spoke about my own personal, because of growing up, I had opportunities to get involved in businesses, to have my own business, and co-found businesses with people, particularly sort of in my 20s. And I look back now and I think, wow, I kick myself. Why did I miss those opportunities? And I know what it was. It was this fear of failure, fear of just absolutely cocking it up, and ending up in debt, or worrying that I just didn't know what I wasn't good enough in some way, and I didn't know everything to be able to do it. And I think in some respects, what's great about social media is that those that do share their entrepreneurial journeys or setting up a business and are very transparent about it will tell you they didn't know everything. They are learning along the way. But we didn't have social media, obviously, when I was growing up, right? And there weren't these mentors or business people that were accessible. They tended to be on, like, you might see them, on the occasional news or at the Grammy Awards or something on, on TV on one of the 4 channels that we had back then. It wasn't somebody locally, there wasn't anybody that I knew that was ultimately a business person that I could approach and say, can you show me how to do this? People just seem to kind of, I don't know, figure it out, or you were kind of born into that lifestyle where that, it was a family business and everything. So, I look back on my own personal journey and there's things I go, oh my goodness, why did I not do that? Why didn't I have the confidence to just go for it? So yeah, we do talk ourselves out things to be safe, to keep ourselves safe. And I've had to reframe that.
Oh, we love keeping ourselves safe, don't we? Absolutely love it. So if you had one piece of advice, Roz, for somebody who's listening to this podcast and they're thinking, actually, I'm really quite unhappy at work. Or like I say, there's been a big change, even, milestone birthday, and they thought, life is too short. You know what? I am ready to take that leap. What would be your one piece of advice for them?
Oh, I mean, I would say if they're on the fence, first and foremost, if you don't take action, where are you going to be this time next year? Probably the same place. And then I would say the advice is, what one action can you take today that will make a change for tomorrow? It doesn't have to be a big action. It might just be picking up the phone to somebody like me, right? But it's just a start, right? And I think the other thing to add to it, sorry, it's quite a long-winded answer and everything, is I think what's helpful is a lot of people will say, I hate my job. And that's quite a broad statement, because your job has many aspects. So one of the things I always say is start with, the job satisfaction wheel, which is that nice little sort of pie chart that's broken up into slices, and start to kind of shade 1 to 10 how bad something is in each of those sections. And it might be salary, it might be the culture of the company, the work itself, because I think what that helps is to start to kind of hone in on what the actual unfulfillment is. And it might be that you discover you actually don't need to change jobs. You've just got to address that. And that might be a sideways move in that organization. It might not be as bad, or as feel as big as making that leap and everything. But for those that where it's genuinely, that pie chart is pretty much shaded in all aspects and they're ready to go, then I would say, yes, what one action can you take today?
That's such a good point, isn't it? That it might not be the whole of your job that you hate, because it's a very sweeping statement, isn't it?
Yeah.
I hate my job. And actually, realistically, how often is that true? I remember years ago, I was working in a residential home for people with long-term mental health problems, and I was really not very happy there at all. But if I look back on it, I think what made me unhappy about it was that my life was slave to the rota. I hated that that my life wasn't my own, because even then I was doing sleep-ins, I was doing night shifts, and I really, it was my freedom that I missed. And also when I was there, the lack of input that I had to the service. So it was impact and freedom that I was really missing. But I really liked the rest of the team, and I really enjoyed working with the people who were living there. They were incredible people who were living there. So it wasn't actually that I hated. It was the system
Yeah.
that I hated. Because then when I went on to work in an outreach system and I went on to manage there, all of a sudden, I really quite enjoyed my job.
Yeah. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's sometimes also it doesn't fit with your values, and you might not have realized that when you applied for that job originally and got it. But then as the course of time has gone on and you've realized that, it has impacted your freedom, and that's a lot of things. That's not seeing family and friends. That's not being able to have time for self-care for yourself and to be able to maybe go to the gym or have hobbies, because you're just on this constant hamster wheel. And absolutely, it could be something, a minor change, where, and of course, back then there probably wasn't the opportunity, I don't know. But it's interesting that sometimes when I'm speaking to clients and we'll talk about something like work-life balance, and I'll ask the question around, well, what are the options? And they start to think about, well, I could maybe put in a flexible working request, or I could do this, or I could have this conversation. But straight away I don't think my boss would be open to that. And it's a case, well, how do you know that? And then, through more questioning, we get to the point where they go, well, actually, no, I don't know that. And then they go away and have that conversation. And then they know, right? It's amazing how many people in exit interviews will say, oh, I'm leaving because I wanted more money, or I wanted more work-life balance. I didn't want to do 5 days a week. I wanted to do 4, or this. And then you've got HR. By this stage, it's too late because the person's handing their resignation. They've got another job, and HR's going, but we could have accommodated that. We didn't know. You didn't say anything. So I think sometimes there's these either assumptions or fear, and it's probably more fear that we can't ask those things because we then worry, does that sort of put a black mark against us? So it's easier to leave than it is to stay with a company where maybe you do enjoy the job, and it's just a couple of things that are making you feel dissatisfied that actually could be addressed. You could move into another department, for example, so, or some sort of sideways move or something. So yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be a case of completely quitting your job and going somewhere else. Sometimes it's just understanding what it is that's not working for you any longer, and actually what are those options available to you.
And as humans, we love to catastrophize, don't we?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if there are bits that you think, like you say, on the whole kind of 4 to 5 working day week, we will, well, if I ask for that, I'll be seen as a shirker and people won't want me, and I'll be, whereas actually, you're right, HR could go, well, you never asked, and we could have done that. So it's not actually that hard, but we like to catastrophize and build up the worst case scenarios in our heads.
Absolutely. And, in most organizations, grown up organizations, culturally, they would much rather have that conversation before somebody resigns, because the cost of replacing that individual, the cost of that person leaving with, that knowledge that they've acquired and the training they've received over time, and then having to go out and pay recruitment costs, doesn't necessarily have to be to an agency. They can have their own internal recruitment team, but the cost of advertising and the time finding that person. And in the UK, we're always on the back foot because ultimately people are on quite long notice periods. But by the time they've resigned and there's been those conversations, they're already working in their notice period, while the poor recruiters then trying to find somebody who's also on 3 months notice. And so there's this gap in service, let's say, which is a massive cost to the business. So HR in many respects is very open to those conversations because they don't want to lose their talent. And I think overall, most hiring managers are pretty good. But I have in the past, no names, worked in organizations, and this was pre-lockdown, by the way, I should say, some years back, where literally if you wanted to move into another department in the same firm, literally your line manager took that to heart. It was like, you'd shot their dog or something. You were dead to them. That was it. Your career was, ended ultimately. And so literally you would have to leave the firm, and it was almost better to go and work for a competitor. It was insane to me that was this culture. I've always taken the approach that, if somebody wants to move departments, we should support that individual in that career move as much as possible. Obviously, it depends on business requirements, but most companies are open to that because they view it as a positive. People are acquiring more knowledge. Therefore, they understand the business better. If it's a client-facing environment, you're able to talk more confidently with experience about what different departments do. So why wouldn't you? But I think as individuals, we can get quite wrapped up. Sometimes it is down to the line manager, the culture. Sometimes it's just the fear of we're going to be, tarred and everything, and that's the end of our promotional opportunities and everything. But I think lockdown, that's probably been the silver lining, is that flexible working now is almost the norm. I mean, literally when I'm interviewing candidates, we are not offering, hybrid working. They're not interested, basically. Sometimes, people contact me and say, do you offer remote working for this job? It's not always possible to provide that because it depends on the nature of the job, but literally they'll just go, I'm out. And I've had people as young as grads say, if it's not remote, I'm not taking the job and everything. So I think people have become a lot more aware of work-life balance and the importance of that and what that needs. And it's unsurprising, if I think back to lockdown, I was still doing a lot of hiring. We were obviously onboarding people virtually, but I'd be having conversations with sort of my hiring managers and interviewers. And one conversation that stuck out was a hiring manager who's, again, I think he's probably in his, midlife, I think probably in his 40s. And, he was one of these people that was always in the office. That's who he was. And suddenly in lockdown, he didn't have that, that option available to him. And he said, for the first time in a long time, I get to walk my kids to school. I get to have lunch with my wife and have a conversation with her. He said, typically I would be coming home, commuting, because he doesn't live in London, but the office is in London. He said, I'd have this 2-hour commute. I'd be coming home late in the evening. I might catch my kids after bath time to read them a story if my train hasn't been delayed. Otherwise, I probably really didn't see them till the weekend. So that had opened up a whole new world to him. And that's the same for everybody. And I think people have suddenly gone, well, we're not going back to that old world, 5 days in the office, those kind of commutes and everything. I think people have also moved out. A lot of people moved out of London further away because they don't need to commute on a daily basis, which has allowed them to get on the property ladder. So there's been that financial consideration. And so that's interesting because, again, trying to hire talent that doesn't necessarily now exist, let's say in London, having to look further afield. And of course, people saying, well, I now live in Yorkshire or I now live in Devon or wherever. And so I'm not even coming in 2 days a week into the office and hybrid, And so there's this big question now about how do we attract top talent and do we need to be flexible? So I think lockdowns, in many respects, that was, I think, a massive positive for people and their sort of mental health and sort of their decision, their sort of career moves and what they want, and spending time, I think, at home with family and not commuting for an hour or 2 hours when you could be using that time to walk the dog or go to the gym or walk your kids to school, or it's just much more productive, right? So that's been interesting.
I could talk to you all afternoon about this. I'm not sure that I'd be able to fit all that into a podcast episode. I'm not Stephen Bartlett just yet. So, Ros, thank you so much for talking about all this. It's absolutely fascinating. I'd never heard of, was it workplace Stockholm syndrome?
Stockholm syndrome, yeah.
That's so interesting. I mean, that's a whole other episode in itself. I'm going to pop that on a post-it note to do some research around. How do people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about you?
Oh gosh. So either on LinkedIn, I tend to spend a lot of my time on there. So they can look me up, they can put in "Get Your Career Unstuck." That's my customized LinkedIn URL, or just search Rozalyn Willocks, and my website is also rosalynwillocks.com.
What I'll do is I'll make sure that all of that goes in the show notes as well, in case people are listening when they're driving or cooking the dinner and don't have a pen and paper to hand. I'll make sure that'll all go in the show notes. So it just reminds me to say thank you so much for coming on the show. I've absolutely loved having you on. There's so much to talk about. And, hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Julie. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life, or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.